This is session 2, What Changes for You as a Leader. Welcome to all of you this great April 26th. Just a reminder of ways that to participate in our webinar. You'll note that you have a very simplified panel to choose from in terms of a chat, a raised hand, or a Q&A. You are off camera because there are many of us in this webinar, but we do encourage you to use your chat. As we have in the last session, we will be using interactive polls, and we'll let you know when that is available through the chat. The session is going to be recorded for reference. So in case, people who might want to reference it or who are not available. And as we go through, we will be going back and forth through different browsers to make this engaging. And so always look for the Zoom icon to come back to the webinar. And so our focus today is what changes for you as a leader. We started this conversation at the end of our last webinar when we started to talk about the differences between management and leadership. Today, we really want to focus on what happens as you moved from perhaps being a staff member or a team player to being the lead of that team. What are the things that you really need to be thinking about? For example, what happens when your belief or your value isn't the same as a decision that's been made by the organization? What are the expectations for you in terms of being a leader? How do you find appropriate networks of support? And this is so important because one of the things that we'll be talking about is the fact that leadership can be a bit lonely, and that relationships do shift when you move into leadership. And the more that you are aware of how things change and what your responsibilities are as you move into leadership, the better that you can navigate them. So for this webinar is going to be led by Carrie Selkirk, who is the senior consultant here at the center. And I'm going to pass it over to her so that she can share her wisdom with you. Welcome, Carrie.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. The introduction that Maria just provided really gives us the overview of what it is that we're going to be doing working together today. And I want to reinforce the comment that Maria made about the difference between leadership and management that we started exploring last week. You'll see that idea come out through the discussion that we have today. And Maria, if you can move to the next slide, what you see here, one of the visuals that I'm going to use throughout this presentation as we discuss these topics is a trip that I took in 2019 to Whistler for about 6 weeks. And this particular image is a lake that you can only get a view of if you hike a 4-hour trail of intermediate difficulty to get up to see the view, or I suppose if you take a helicopter up. And I want to talk about during this 6-week adventure that I had, there was a leader, a guide who supported a group of us who were on these hiking and kayaking and cycling adventures. And this leader in this particular instance, asking us to take this trail and do this hike, really used the vision and the why in order to encourage us to want to go on this particular adventure. And that vision of getting to see this view, this beautiful lake that many people don't get to see, is how she led us into taking on this adventure. And then on the next slide, you can still see the lake a little bit in the background, and you can see some of the terrain that we traversed on our hike. And this is where the leader, the individual, really acted in that management capacity, needing to make sure that we all understood the rules to safely get there and get back. An example of a rule that you should be able to see from here is keeping at least 6 feet apart, so that if somebody did lose their footing, it wasn't a domino effect of a number of people falling, potentially hurting themselves, and then needing to get someone to help them get off of the mountain. There were many other rules, and some of those rules were specific to individuals. So somebody who had a knee issue got some advice and guidance as to how to make sure that they hiked effectively with that. There were folks who were scared of heights, and some problem solving was done there. So again, that just remembering as we go through the difference between that leadership piece, seeing the vision, and the management piece, which is supporting everybody to get to the vision safely and together. So our content today is, as Maria mentioned, if you are in this webinar because you have recently moved into a management or leadership position, or you are considering making that kind of a move in your career, there's lots of changes that you need to think about related to that. And we have a list of them here that we're going to walk through. First, we want to check in and do a poll. So Kathleen will be putting the poll in the chat for you to click on, and the question will come up on the screen as well as when you click on the link. And we want to hear what 2 or 3 words describe the best leader or manager that you've ever worked with. Give a minute for the responses to start coming in. And here we have people who act as mentors and coaches, as being great leaders and or managers. We have people who are honest, which is really important. And I notice some people are putting the comments in the chat. If you could click on the link that Kathleen posted, but I'll keep my eye on the chat as well. We have transparency and communication, visionary, somebody who listens and is fun, positive attitude, someone who supports, is empowering, someone who's fair, someone who is a believer, and that I'm assuming that that may speak to being a believer in the mission and also a believer in the individuals that work with them, a cheerleader, somebody who guides and engages. That's some great language and something to think about, somebody who made me feel heard and is trusting. So we'll go back to the presentation now. And if you're not, what you want to do is look for that little Zoom camera picture. Click on that, and that will take you from your browser back to your Zoom window so that we can explore this a little bit further. That was a fantastic list, and some of the things that we talk about today, and many of the things that we talk about throughout the rest of the series, you will see reflected in that list that you provided. So setting a bit of context here before we dive into some of the topics. And if we move to the next slide, and as I sort of speak about my adventure in Whistler, I want to share with you something that I'm very proud of, and that is that I bungee jumped for the first time. And to me, bungee jumping and jumping into a new position as a leader or a manager have a number of similarities. Maybe not everything, but a number of things that I think can be brought to consider. So what you see in the inset in that slide is that I was wearing a heart rate monitor when I did this jump. I am personally afraid of heights. This was actually at the end of my 6 weeks. This is something that I decided I wanted to do to celebrate having accomplished the 6-week adventure that I did. And I've circled in that heart rate monitor graph that I've provided 2 points. The first one is the point where my blood pressure or my heart rate, went the highest. And the point where it went, I guess maybe the second or third highest. And the point where it went the highest is the point where I actually got to the edge of the bridge, was prepared to jump, and then decided not to. And I backed away from the edge and said I wasn't going to do it. Funnily enough, the folks who were there to support my safety and whatnot made a point of sharing that I wouldn't get my money back if I didn't jump in. And I expressed that that was the least of my concerns at that moment. But they left me in that harness. I said, give me a minute and let me make a decision if I'm going to do this or if I'm really not going to do it. And you can see that the second peak that's circled is actually the point where I did make the jump off of the bridge. So one of the things that made me realize when I looked at this chart afterwards is sometimes making the jump isn't quite as stressful as thinking about making the jump. So whether it's moving into a new role as a leader or manager, whether it's many of the situations that you come across as a leader or manager, sometimes just doing it really supports you to be able to move forward, feel better about what's happening rather than spending a whole lot of time thinking about it. So we're going to move to another poll. Hopefully everybody has that connection to the poll, and Kathleen just popped it in again, and Maria will put that up for us. So this poll is about how many of us on the call are in different situations. Are you leading a project? Are you leading part-time? Are you in a rotating leadership position? Are you a full-time leader but don't currently have a team that works with you? Or are you a full-time leader with a team? And I'll give folks a second to get that poll completed. So many of the people on the call are a full-time leader working with a team. And there's a number of people in each of the other situations here. And all of these situations, we're going to have information that will be able to support you in thinking about how you're transitioning into that situation, or even if you've been in that situation for a little while, some thoughts related to how you move forward in that situation. So thank you. We'll close the poll now and move back. And the next slide starts to speak to some of the changes that you do find as you move into a leadership position. And the first one we want to talk about is change in professional identity. So the picture you have here is our guide, manager leader of our adventure over the 6 weeks in Whistler. Her name is Kat, and that's her dog Bear. And Kat was previously a professional skier. She missed sort of her opportunity to do her final Olympic bid due to an injury. And at that point in time realized that it was time for her to make a change in career. So she changed her career to become a fitness guide, wilderness lead, an adventurer, taking groups out in Whistler and other places to do the kind of activity that one loves to do in the outdoors. But it really created a huge change for her. In the past, as a solo skier, her only success was related to her activities, what she did or didn't do. As she moved into this new role, she really needed to think about and change her perspective to realize that she was only successful if the people that she was leading were successful, and that's something that we want to explore a little bit more. On the next slide, you'll see some examples of what may change in how you see yourself. So again, what made you successful before, which in many cases in frontline positions, sometimes you're working as a team, but also it's very much your own activity that supports your success. Your professional identity may change. You are part of the team still, but in a different way. And how you spend and focus your time and energy also changes. And you'll see throughout the presentations, I can't recall if we had any last week, but there are links at the bottom that are available to you in the PDF that you receive that provide additional resources if you want to read more about a particular topic. So we want to talk a little bit about what may be different for you in your day-to-day work. The next slide has some examples of that. I won't speak through all of them, but I will point out a few of them. One of them is related to your role in meetings. Besides the fact that you will likely participate in more of them, you will be participating in a different way. You will either be leading the meeting, you may be have more takeaway work than you might have otherwise, and generally need to be more actively engaged. We always hope that everyone is actively engaged in meetings, but leader and managers, there's a higher expectation of that. Communication, You are engaged more in systemic communication, systemic decision-making. You'll think about confidentiality in new ways. You'll still need to consider confidentiality of patients and clients. You'll also need to think about confidentiality related to the people that report to you in your organization and related to additional organizational information that you may be privy to that is confidential. Your priorities in your area of expertise, again, as I spoke about with Kat, it's going to become less about your individual technical standpoint and more about broader factors, which also means less time potentially spent on daily tasks and more coordinating organization of projects and longer term priorities. There will be less certainty in your role quite often, and you need to take some time, or I would suggest you take some time reflecting on how you deal with certainty and some of the things you may need to do to sort of improve your resilience related to uncertainty. And again, as mentioned with Kat, it's really about other people accomplishing things and how you support other people to accomplish things. And we will, you'll get some more tips and tricks about that as we go through more of our webinar series. On the next slide, we speak to changes in how others see you. So when you were a member of the team, you likely would have been one of the people in the picture celebrating the accomplishment of whatever project or priority that you were working on. And sort of simply put, when you're the leader or manager of the team, you're going to be the one taking the picture of everybody who's celebrating. So you have a role in how you are part of the team, but again, how you work with the team differently. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about a couple of examples. We're going to talk about legacies of predecessors, which everybody generally has some kind of legacy to overcome when they move into a new management or leadership role, what the lens of manager leader means, and some thinking about what you say and do and how it reflects on the organization when you're in a management leadership role. So from a legacy perspective, again, most leaders and managers come into roles and have some kind of legacy of the previous leader manager. Even if you're in a brand new leadership or management role that's been created, the people who are part of your team will have reported to somebody in the past. And the legacy of that leader could be a positive legacy. They could have been a fantastic leader that everybody really enjoyed working with. It could be a legacy that has left people a little bit suspicious of what your approach will be to leadership and management if they didn't have a good relationship with the leader. Interestingly, sometimes the hardest to overcome is where people have had a fantastic relationship with their leader. And that's because in addition to dealing with change, they're also dealing with some grieving of losing a leader that they really respected, that they really enjoyed working with. So that sort of doubles up on the challenges that people have during that change. So the first thing that we advise is know that whatever is happening in those first days is not about you, it's about that legacy. They don't know you yet. All they know is what the leader was like before, and either they're sad and grieving because they've lost a leader that they really appreciated, or again, they're in a place where they're just not 100% sure what it's going to be like with a new leader manager because they didn't have the best experience with their previous leader or manager. So in those early days, it's not about you. But you need to do things to make it about you as a leader, you as their manager. One of those things that you can do is establish credibility. Certainly you don't want to stand up at a meeting and rhyme off everything in your resume, but take the opportunity to let people know where you come from, where your expertise is, how you've gotten to the place that you are as a leader or manager. Articulate your style and your expectations early. So again, people are weary of change and also the unknown. So if you're very clear about your style and your expectations up front, and then you stick to that style and expectations, then you will give people some certainty about how things move forward. When things aren't working out well in the early days, spend some time seeking to understand. Again, is it about you and a particular situation? Is it about that they're just, you know, not used to your style and they need to think about doing things different? And be clear and consistent. People will often boundary test. If you set your expectations and they're different expectation than what they're used to, they might push the boundaries a little bit to see whether you're really going to stick by them. And you do need to do that in order to develop that respect, in order to develop that trust that people know you will say what you're going to do and you do what you say, which is also walking the talk. Show them as well as tell them who you are, how you operate, and what your expectations are. Welcome feedback from people. It's always an opportunity to have a conversation, set or reset expectations, and be human, which is messy. And I think most people have had experiences with leaders who haven't been able to put that human side forward. But if you make a mistake, you know, apologize for that mistake, have a conversation about what's going to happen differently next time. And again, walk that talk of what you expect of other people. How you communicate as a leader is going to change as well on the next slide. Again, knowing that it's not about you, it's about what they've experienced in the past and getting used to something new. One thing that we find that leaders and managers really need to spend some time thinking about is how will you communicate decisions that you don't agree with? So again, you're now in a role where you represent the organization internally in a different way than you ever did in the past. You need to communicate decisions in a way that staff maintain confidence in you as a leader and the leadership of the organization at large. You will need to enforce these decisions. So think about if you present a decision by sort of grumbling about it and, well, I don't really agree with this, but this is what we have to do. It may make it harder to enforce these decisions when somebody in the future doesn't align with it. And your role as a manager is to talk to them about that. So as a leader manager, you're not representing your own opinion. You're representing the organization, and you need to think about the kinds of things that you're going to say to put that decision forward in a way that people understand that it is what is going to happen. So you can say things like there were many factors at play. You know, in many cases, a decision has pros and cons. There's not often a perfect decision that doesn't have any cons associated with it. So you can say it was a difficult decision. And if necessary, get some support from other leaders. I worked with a team once where a team of leaders who would get together, and if one of them really wasn't comfortable with a decision, they would talk to their co-leaders, their teammates, and say, can you help me better understand this decision? Can you tell me the kinds of things that you're saying when you're presenting it so that we can be consistent and I can make sure I'm speaking to the decision in the right way? We're going to move on to a different part of change now, and the change here is in how you see others. So this particular slide shows kayaking adventure, and Bear would sometimes join us on our kayaking adventures, and the example here really is about how great Bear was on hikes and on land. And he was pretty good in kayaks too, but every once in a while he'd decide to jump off the kayak in search of some ducks. And then it took all of us coming together to support him getting back into a kayak. And you know, when you work with teammates, as teammates, there may be things that you really appreciate about them as a teammate. There may be things that you don't understand about them or don't appreciate as much as a teammate. And you may find that as you switch into a leadership and management role, your perspective of some of those things changes. So the really fun teammate may be the teammate that's jumping into the water to go after ducks every once in a while, which is kind of fun as a teammate again, but when you're leading or managing that person, it brings a whole different perspective to it. So a few other things about the change in how you see others. One of them is that you are required to give feedback as a leader and manager. When you are a teammate, hopefully you do have a comfort level and your team works together in such a fashion that you're able to give each other feedback. But when you become a leader or manager, that escalates to being a requirement. You also must walk towards conflict as a leader or manager. So again, as a team member, if you see conflict happening, it is not your responsibility to resolve conflict amongst your teammates, although again, it may be something that you support your teammates with if you have the skill and ability to do that. In most cases, the best way to deal with conflict when you're a team member is to not get involved and let the individual sort it out, or let a leader or manager support them in sorting it out. But now you are a leader or manager. You must walk towards it because if you don't, it may escalate and eventually you will have to become involved. And you must determine the best approach to support others' success. So let's talk a little bit about feedback. There are a few points that we would provide that makes it fairly easy and short to remember the steps of feedback. There is, again, a resource here with additional tips on giving feedback. Our first point is to be kind. And I think that's something that sometimes people are challenged with, thinking that being kind means not addressing a behavior, not making the other person uncomfortable, not making the other person feel like they've not met expectations. But when you really think about it, that isn't a kind approach. Because if behavior is happening that isn't an appropriate behavior, and you don't address it early and provide feedback, then again, it will escalate and they may find themselves in a situation of discipline or something that could have been avoided if they'd received feedback early. So being kind means addressing things early and seek to understand why a behavior is occurring so that potentially you can support them with some constructive ideas. Again, being clear is also being kind. Some people, sort of try to hedge what they're saying to soften it. And in many cases, that can result in a misunderstanding about what the issue is. I remember a staff member once saying to me when I asked them, how do you want to get feedback? And they said, whatever you do, don't use the sandwich approach, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, which is giving good feedback and then sort of constructive feedback after that and closing with good feedback. And this individual said, that just confuses me. I don't understand the issue when I'm getting, it sort of feels like mixed messages to me. Now that approach works with many people, but this particular individual had said, please don't use that approach. So it's also good to have conversations with people about how they want to receive feedback, but regardless of that, really make sure that you've stated the issue clearly. Be constructive, make sure you've got the time available to discuss solutions. So, try to give feedback when you have a few minutes to have that conversation so that you can understand why it happened, talk about solutions, get some commitment from them to a solution. And then one that many people are challenged with is the follow-up. So again, you give feedback, you come up with solutions, you go on about your day and a million other things come up. Certainly you want to address the issue if it comes up again, but also you want to address the issue if you see that people have been implementing solutions and are improving. You want to provide that positive feedback and make sure you've taken time to do that. So we're going to move to another poll. If you can click on that polls link again, or if you still have it up in your browser, just go back to it. Maria is going to change us to the next poll on the screen so we can all see it. And we'd like you to reflect and consider which of those 4 aspects I just talked about of giving feedback tend to be the most challenging for you. So being clear and following up, and it's not uncommon for those two to come up fairly high. And I think, again, for the reasons probably that I already described, that being clear when you're trying to be kind sometimes feels like a conflicting goals. Hopefully, as you think about it more, you can realize that they're not conflicting goals, that they actually work very well together. And the follow-up, absolutely, again, that can sometimes be challenging. You've addressed something, there's a million other priorities, and you don't often think you have the time to take the opportunity to follow up on it, but knowing again that follow-up can also be a way of being kind to support people with the work that they need to do. So thank you for that. If you can move back to the Zoom platform by looking for that little camera again. We're going to move to approaching the situation in an adaptive way based on the individual that you're working with. So this model was created by Hersey and Blanchard, and there's a link below the model to an article that gives you a little bit more information about it. For those of you who are doing the certificate, we're actually going to be asking you to read that article related to your reflection questions. But this is called situational leadership. Sometimes the 4 quadrants that we have here have different names associated with them, but they are all, the quadrants still move in the same direction. And again, it speaks to having a leadership style that isn't static, that looks at the individual and the situation that they're in and gives that individual what they need in order to be successful in that situation. So I'll walk you through our 4 quadrants, starting with quadrant 1, which is directing. And directing really is about a situation where the person is potentially motivated to do the task. They're eager to do what they're told to do, but they really don't have any experience with the task. They don't know where to start. And what they need is an understanding of how the task is done. So your communication and your leadership style in that case is to be very clear about the steps that need to be taken, to be very clear about your expectations, to do a lot of follow-up to ensure that those steps are being taken and that the process is moving forward, whatever the project or the situation is. Ensure that the individual is following the steps, which will make them successful in doing what needs to be done the first time that they've done something. We'll give them some confidence and we'll give them some competence. So much of your communication is from you to them, providing them with the information that they need to know. Of course, there will always be some supportive behavior related to thanks for completing that task. You did a really good job on that task. But that's really what it is you providing support from you're doing a good job doing what I'm telling you to do. You move into coaching when they've started to develop some competence, but are still not completely confident and still need a fair bit of direction to make sure that they are bringing together the pieces that they're learning in an ability to apply it to new situations that are similar. So from a coaching perspective, you're still telling them what to do in many cases, and you're also starting to talk to them about why you're asking them to do what they do, why you take particular steps, developing their confidence, developing their competence, so that they can start to take these things on their own going forward. From there, you move into a supporting mode, which starts to have much lower directive behavior. They now have dealt with this type of situation a couple of times. They can apply what they've learned, and your supportiveness is encouraging them that they do know what to do, is answering questions that they have. So they may say, I'm thinking of taking this step next and that step next. And you can either confirm that that's the right step, or you can give them a little bit of redirection if they need it. You can ask them, well, why would you take that step? Think about perhaps why you might do something different. So you're really having a dialogue, you're not having to direct them as much. And then you move into quadrant 4, which is where somebody is feeling very competent, very confident. They've dealt with a situation or something similar to it before. You can simply delegate a task. They're highly motivated. You tell them the task that you need done, the project that you need worked on, and you both understand that they will come to you when they need advice, if they've, if they need a little bit of additional direction on a particular part of it. It's really a check-in situation, and you're expecting them to be the leader in communicating to you, to lead the types of communications that you need to have together to ensure that they've got what they need to get the project done. So something to think about again through the rest of our webinars as you consider some of the subject areas that we're talking about, how you define different ways of approaching people based on the individual and the situation, and perhaps some reflection, which you will be asked to do if you're doing the certificate, on which one of these areas do you need to spend a bit of time thinking about developing further? Which one of these areas are you least comfortable in and therefore might want to think about some additional work on? We're now going to move into the area of change that is your influence and your approach. We'll move to the next slide. We're going to talk about your approach now being empowering others versus success from your own contribution, which I've touched on a little bit already. Some of you will have a dual role, being a leader and a frontline worker. And in that case, your leadership role must always influence how you carry yourself in your frontline role. And the idea of leading with empathy and connectedness, but how that's different than friendship when you're working as a leader or manager. So we want to look at the model that is relational leadership. And again, we've got a resource there so that you can do a little bit of additional reading on this if you'd like. But the idea that a relational process of people attempting to accomplish change to benefit the common good is deeply focused on the building and cultivating of relationships. So this is a model that is quite well known and well utilized in the types of sectors and industries that you are working in. It's not a requirement for a formal leadership position, but it's a philosophy, and it's a way you want to think about how you're practicing as a leader. So I'm going to touch on the 5 areas that we have expressed here in the slide. We want to talk about a relational leadership being a purposeful leader, somebody who understands change and change management and what to do to support people during change, someone who shares values with the organization and has a shared purpose with the organization. So going back to think of your why. Does your why align with the why of the organization? And are you able to articulate that? Not in a formal way, but in the way that you speak to people inside your organization and outside your organization. Anybody can be a relational leader, regardless of the position they have. If they have formal management, formal supervisor, formal leadership indicated in their roles. Relational leadership, again, it's a philosophy and it's how you go about your work, regardless of what your role is. Relational leaders are inclusive. They have an awareness of their self and others, valuing diversity. So knowing where your own strengths are, where your own areas that you want to work on are, understanding that by bringing diverse perspectives, that supports everybody to be stronger, because the areas where you may not be as strong, somebody else will be, and constantly valuing that as you move through the types of work that you need to do. Empowering people. So understanding that some practices and some applications of power inhibit growth and some promote growth. and empowerment. And again, we're going to talk about that language of power and influence as we move through these sessions. Process oriented. So that means not just dealing with individual situations, but having a really good understanding of community processes, group processes, and the relationships amongst the individuals. And knowing that if you can get group processes right, and that means group processes that value diversity, that don't use power in a negative way, that have purpose. If you use those processes well, you will make better decisions as a group, you will work better together as a group, and you will meet your outcomes. And a relational leader is ethical. So as an individual, having a commitment to your social responsibility, commitment to authenticity, commitment to developing trust and maintaining trust and integrity is also a part of being a relational leader. So again, I would encourage reading the resource that we have there. It gives you a little bit more depth on this concept of a relational leader, but it's something that we would encourage any person in any organization, regardless of the position that they're in, to think about how they show these behaviors, how they show relational leadership in the work that they do. And finally, we want to talk a bit about the change that is your networks of support. So here you see me just before I actually did the launch off the bridge, and thinking about the different networks of support that I needed there compared to anything else that I do in my life. I generally don't need to wear a harness as part of my daily life and the support that I get. There's individuals up there who've been checking and double checking my harness, who make sure that the bungee cord is working properly for me, who were cheering me on, and all kinds of different things from what my day-to-day networks might look like. So when you become a leader or a manager, there are changes in your networks of support there as well. In particular, if you're in an organization where you're going to be leading or managing previous colleagues, one of the key points there is that you can no longer be a passive recipient of complaints. Just like, as I mentioned earlier, you need to walk towards conflict and support resolution of conflict. And I would really encourage you as you become a new leader or manager, or if you're moving into a leadership or management role in a new organization, that you make sure you seek out opportunities to develop appropriate supportive relationships. So we have a grid here, a little chart for you to think about and consider as you move into new roles. And the first one really is about friendships, and I've mentioned that in the earlier slide. You may have friendships in a previous team that when you were colleagues, that you need to think about how those need to evolve and how those might need to look different when you move into a leadership management role, in particular, if that individual is now somebody that reports to you. You need to think about issues about how you're developing relationships with the new people who report to you that are empathetic and collegial and connected relationships without crossing into that friendship zone. Because when you think about it as a leader or manager, there's now a different balance of power. You need to think about maintaining equity amongst your team. If you have a friendship that results in you spending more time, confiding more in one team member than others, then that could cause some concern within your team. You have confidentiality obligations to the organization and other legal responsibilities to the organization related to the people that report to you. When we look at complaints, again, if somebody comes to you with a complaint, you cannot, as a leader or manager, commit to confidentiality before you hear the complaint and understand what it is. The organization has responsibilities, for example, around workplace harassment, has responsibilities around legislation and policy around client and patient safety, other occupational health and safety. If somebody, when you weren't a manager, somebody could come to you and sort of complain or grumble about something, you might give them a little bit of advice. Hopefully your advice is, please go talk to the person that you're having challenges with, or let's take this to the Occupational Health and Safety Committee, or let's take this to the supervisor. When you're a leader or manager, you have to know in advance, and they have to know in advance that anything they tell you, you may need to act upon. You need to support problem solving. So you can't just be a listening ear anymore. And it may be various levels of problem solving. It may be, okay, well, have you approached and talked to the person yet as per our conflict resolution policy? If no, well, let's talk about what you need in order to be able to do that, as an example. And you need to be prepared to escalate the issue if it's necessary for escalation. You need to be prepared that people are going to ask you for information that you can't share. You do need to be aware that that is much different perhaps than it has been in the past. So when somebody calls you and says, I'm not going to be in for the next couple of days because there's been a death in the family, you can't just assume that you can tell everybody else that there's been a death in the family. You want to ask the question immediately, is this something I can share with others? Because if the individual does not want it shared, you cannot share it as a representative of the organization. People will ask. People who are used to being able to talk to you about things, people will get into a little bit of a guessing game sometimes. You need to be aware when people are sort of digging. You're welcome to share with people. You know, it puts me in a difficult position when you ask me these questions because that's confidential for that individual and I'm not in a position to share it. You will have a need for a confidant at some point in time. And again, this is where we get into what those networks need to look like. If you're sharing information with somebody because they have been a confidant in the past, they may spend moments wondering, boy, I wonder what they're sharing with other people if they're telling me that. Again, setting up one team member to be closer to you can damage the relationship with that individual if you need to hold them accountable to something later, and can damage the relationships within the team if the team realizes that this is happening. So make sure you're taking some time to cultivate productive relationships with management colleagues. It may be those within your organization, it may be those outside of your organization in similar positions. And most importantly, make sure that you have a productive relationship with the leader that you report to. Speaking about challenging your decision, that will happen, and you need to think about how you're going to respond to that. You don't want to be defensive. You want to be open and authentic and explain a decision and listen to their perspective, but do not commit to changing that decision, which doesn't mean that you can't potentially change it with more information, but never commit to changing it until you know you have all of the information and that it's the right thing to do. And again, recognizing that people will test boundaries. You want to be consistent. And if you slip up, which you might on occasion, acknowledge it, apologize, rectify it as soon as you realize it. And people will appreciate that transparency. So finally, I just want to spend a brief moment after speaking about all this change, which may seem a little bit overwhelming, about what stays the same when you become a leader or manager. And it really is going back to the work that we did at the last session. It's your why that stays the same. So to wrap up some of my sharing about my adventure in Whistler in 2019, I expected to enjoy hiking. I expected to enjoy kayaking. I really wasn't sure how I would feel about cycling. It had been a long time since I'd been on a bicycle. And in fact, I found a new passion in cycling. First thing I did when I got home was buy a new bicycle. And, you know, my why about going on these kinds of adventures was about being in nature, was about seeing different things, was about having new experiences. And I discovered a new way of accomplishing that, which was doing it by bicycle, in addition to some of the other ways that I do it. And that's how I look at that transition to leadership and management when you've been in frontline. Your why hasn't changed. The way you're going to go about accomplishing your why, the tools that you're going to use to do it, are different as a leader or manager. So for those of you who are engaging in the certificate program, you'll see the reflection questions here on this slide, and you'll also, you will have access to those reflection questions. And just as last time, they're due the day of our next session. And at this point, I'm going to hand it back over to Maria. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks so much, Carrie. I love the way that you're able to weave a story throughout a topic that is so critical. One of the things that when we were surveying executive directors and supervisors about the types of things that would be important for us to focus on, this was a topic that came up a lot. And that is that some people move into leadership and there really isn't any information about what it means and how things change and what the responsibilities, both legally, ethically, and in terms of being a team lead, mean. So thank you, Carrie, for bringing that together for us. And hopefully you have found some of the information either assuring because you've been in that position for a while, or perhaps there's a few things that you've learned along the way that will be helpful. So in terms of the questions that you're looking in terms of reflection, and even I think if you're not doing the certificate, they might be helpful to think about. So one is now looking at the why from the perspective of the organization. So what do you want your legacy as a leader to be in your organization? The second point, again, I think something that we hear a lot about, but for many of us who've been in leadership, we know that leadership is lonely and can be lonely. And something that will set you up for success is for you to really think about those networks of support that Carrie talked about. So the second piece will be actions that you will be able to take and be able to really strengthen that. So really thinking about who are some people that could be my mentor or my confidant. How do I really expand that circle of support from a leadership perspective? And again, if you've been a leader for a while, are there others that you might want to invite into your circle to ensure that you keep that freshness that is also necessary in leadership? And finally, the last piece, as Carrie mentioned, was that situational leadership article that we hope that you read. For those of you who've done situational leadership, you know that there's courses and courses and courses on this. We find that framework one of the most important frameworks to be able to really understand leadership from the perspective of service and from the perspective of being able to understand what people need and providing the leadership that's required at that point. So we invite you to read that and really think about where are the areas of stretch that you might need in order to be able to be a more effective leader and manager. So with that, we'd like to close again, like we did last time, just by getting a sense of what this was like for you. So I'll ask Kathleen to put the link back on, as she did. Thank you, Kathleen. And the last question for today is the same as last. So one word to describe how the session was for you. If you're using two words, just put a little hyphen so it sticks together. So I'll activate that. Once you've answered, in order for you to see the responses from your colleagues, you'll need to come back onto Zoom and be able to see it. So how are you leaving? Validated. Awesome. Thank you. Relatable. Great. Informative. Introspective. Excited. Refreshed. Motivational. Excellent. Affirmed. Encouraged. Inspired. Clearer. Good. Confirming. Hopeful. Intrigued. Enlightening. Rested. Relatable. Okay. Excellent. Thank you so much. We've received many of the certificate entries. So thank you to those who took the time to do those. We will be marking those and getting those back to you as well. Have a wonderful rest of your Monday and the rest of your week. Thanks very much. Take care. Bye-bye.